For this demonstration, I'm going to create a data source. So let's open an existing project. I have the project that I created in the previous module, the report solution, and I'm going to add the shared data source for the AdventureWorks DW 2008 R2 database. So here in my project, which I can see in the Solution Explorer, I've got the Shared Data Sources folder. I'll just right-click on that folder and select Add New Data Source. I'll give the data source a name. Now when I create the name, I need to provide a name that doesn't have any spaces embedded in it, and it has to start with a letter. Generally speaking, you should give it the same name as the database you're using to make it easy to understand what the data source file relates to. So that means I'll call it AdventureWorks DW 2008 R2. Now we need to use a Microsoft SQL Server data provider for this data source, which is the default, but you can see here in the drop-down list all of the available data providers. If you know the connection string syntax, you can click in the connection string box and then type out the string. Or you can use the Edit button to use the Connection Properties dialog box as a guide through the development of the connection string. So for the server name, I'll use the localhost using a dot here as a shortcut, and then in the drop-down below, I'll select the database name, AdventureWorks DW 2008 R2, and click OK. I'll click OK again to add the RDS file to my project, which I can now see in Solution Explorer. If I later need to edit this data source, I can just double-click the file and then edit the connection string here. Also, let's take a look at the credentials page. Here you can see the default is Windows Integrated Security, which will pass the user's credentials to the underlying data source. Alternatively, I could hard-code a username, or I could prompt the user for credentials, and if I were to select that option, I would also provide some text here that displays to the user to let them know that the credentials are needed. And then if the data source doesn't require credentials, I can select the last option here. Do not use credentials. I'll set this back to Windows Authentication. And so at this point I have a shared data source, but it's not yet associated in any way with the reports that I have in this project. Now I added a report to this project in the demonstration in the previous module, this report 1.rdl, and so now I'm going to edit this report by adding a reference to the shared data source. Now the report designer that's currently open in the workspace, that's shown in the center of the screen, relates to the report 1.rdl, as you can see by the name that displays on the tab at the top of the workspace. Now with this report open, I can access the report data pane. That appears over here on the left next to the toolbox, and if you don't see it, you can use the View menu to find it. Now sometimes you'll open up the View menu and you won't see that report data pane, so all you have to do is come to the workspace, just click anywhere in the background here, and then go back to the View menu. You'll see the report data option appear at the very bottom. The report data pane has a data sources folder in it, and that's where I can add a reference to a shared data source, or I can add an embedded data source. So I can just right-click on the folder here and select the command Add Data Source. And now I need to provide a name for the data source reference. And I'll just use the same name as the data source to minimize confusion. Now remember, this time I'm just adding a definition of the data source to the report itself. And I can create an embedded connection here, much as I did when creating the shared data source a moment ago. But remember that an embedded data source can only be changed by opening up the report that it belongs to. So instead, we'll use the best practice method and reference the shared data source. Now, if I didn't already have a shared data source in the project, I have a new button here that would allow me to create a shared data source for the project. Instead, I'll just use the drop-down list, and that shows me all of the available shared data sources in my project. And before I click OK, notice in the report data pane that there's nothing in the data sources folder. When I click OK, now I have the reference added. Now my data source reference here is available in the report data pane, but remember, it's only a reference. Notice the arrow icon here to indicate that this is a shared data source. An embedded data source reference would not have an arrow superimposed on the database icon as you see here.